This event is co-sponsored by both the Language Resource Center and the Latin American Studies Program, and is funded in part from a grant from the Undergraduate International Studies and Foreign Language grant that was given to the Latin American Studies Program from the U.S. Department of Education, with additional funding provided through the Vice Provost for International Studies. So please welcome Edvan.
Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. Maybe I should speak louder. It's back. After a short glass of wine, I think I'm more prepared to present. So first of all, thank you all for coming. I also would like to thank Angelica Kramer for the invitation. Thank you, the Language Resource Center and the Latin American Studies Program for bringing me here. So it's been a pleasure. And so it's been just a day and a half, but being here has been wonderful. So thank you. And the way this presentation is set up is just to give you kind of my perspective on how to handle teaching culture in a foreign language classroom. But we are, for those who teach, I don't think there'll be anything new for you, because it's going to be a conversation, and I hope you can relate to some of what I'm going to say and find out or discover what passions you have in relation to how you can handle culture in your classrooms. So, and this is how I'm planning to do it. So I'll be discussing briefly what made me prepare this presentation about culture, and also my goal with this presentation. And after that, I'll be discussing some connections between language and culture itself. This was mostly as a, I guess, a discussion about what all language instructors, at least in the US, kind of hear a lot about. So it's just to remind ourselves about some benchmarks in relation to teaching culture in the US. And then the issue of language identity and representation. And so, and after that, I will focus on the topic of my research, which included language variation study in a favela in Rio de Janeiro. And bringing favela, I have to talk about race and migration. And then the actual study will require me to explain some of the main characteristics of the community where I did my research, City of God. And then I'll try to come back to where I started, and hopefully all of that will make sense and you'll have questions and can talk about them. Okay, so first of all, just to start, what comes to mind when you think of the word Brazil? And just throw like few words that you usually connect with Brazil. Football. Soccer. What else? Huh? Music. Yes. Soccer, football, dancing. Yes.
The forest.
Forest. Yes. What else? Just a couple more.
Japanese immigrants.
Japanese immigrants is a very good one. Not very many people know about that. So I can show you just a few things that are usually answers to that question. So we can talk about the natural resources, the beach, the forest. If you have been following the news, probably this forest has some smoke in it, because the forest has been burning. So carnival, soccer. Usually people say soccer, but I don't think they are thinking about women playing soccer. So it's a rare image. Or for those who have any knowledge of Rio de Janeiro, this is probably the first image we think about when we talk about Brazil. And so these are what we could say stereotypical images or ideas about Brazil. And they help us understand what Brazil is and how Brazilians live. And so all these things are very interesting to me from the point of view of a language instructor, because I rely on some of these images to teach my students about Brazil and about Brazilians. So they are pretty much, some of them could be defined as stereotypes or mainstream representations of Brazil. And going there, I just will tell you very briefly a story about an event that I was invited to participate in. So right after I moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where I live now, a group of Brazilians organized celebration of the Brazil Independence Day, which is September 7th, just last week. And there was a moment where somebody read briefly the story of Brazil in like 5 minutes. And there was this reading, and the person started with the Portuguese in 1500 and all of that, and the indigenous. And all of a sudden, we were with the Japanese, and then it's current Brazil, and I was like, okay. And then at the end, I asked the person, why you never talked about slavery or Afro-Brazilians? And then the person replied to me, oh, we did not want to include the negative things, just the positive things. And I was like, so then you are throwing my whole history away, because I'm part of the country, of the culture, but if you don't mention that, you do not explain how I went to Brazil in the first place. So it's a painful story, yes, but we need to face it. So that actually made me think about what people are mostly likely to talk in relation to, let's say, Brazilian culture, and things they might avoid because they may feel uncomfortable or it's not a okay topic to talk about, things like that. And so, sorry, let me go back there. And so that prompted me to think about our profession as a cultural ambassador. What would that be? It's pretty much somebody who has a realistic point of view in relation to the cultures that we represent. And hopefully we are not non-judgmental, meaning we don't select specific aspects of the culture and say this is good and this is bad. We present them and let people make their choices. So are we cultural ambassadors or cultural advertisers? People who have to sell a good image of the cultures we represent. And in that sense, of course, we are going to avoid anything that may cause any, I don't know, problem, or is going to create an image that we think is not going to be good for, let's say, our language program or for the students to have if they ever go there to visit. And so I think we are maybe a little bit of both, but I want to believe that we are cultural ambassadors. And in doing that, we should challenge and deconstruct stereotypical and mainstream images of these cultures we represent. And we can do that by presenting alternative images, because they will help us tell the story. It's not to replace the mainstream with the alternative, but to present them side by side. And so because of that, in this presentation, my goal was to give you or to explore some of the social cultural aspects of Brazilian favelas. First, because they usually are presented or represented with mainstream elements, and we are going to talk about them in a few minutes. And I will illustrate that discussion with this study that I conducted in City of God, which is a predominantly Black community or neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, the language instructors will be able to look at their own situation, their own languages and cultures that they teach in their classrooms, and look for ways in which they can use social and cultural issues in relation to those cultures to promote language learning, and more importantly, cultural awareness among the US students we have in our classrooms. Another exercise, I'll ask you one more. So now, all this discussion about language and culture has to do with, so the way we teach language and the way we teach culture has to do with how we understand these concepts. And so just like very briefly, what would you say a language is? What is your definition of a language? Could be just one word. Communication. Some people would say a system. Yes, system of communication, expression. Identity, it's a good one. Yeah, like a set of rules, grammar.
Culture.
Yeah, culture. And what about culture? How do you define culture? So this is not for us to create a definition. Not even the scholars who study these things have a unique definition. It's just for us to brainstorm. What is a culture?
Dynamic.
It's dynamic.
The list of values.
Values, a list of values. Plus it informs the way I see things and do things and relate to others, right? So if we look at some of the main definitions we see about language, we say it's a system of communication, the set of arbitrary rules, mostly known as a grammar or grammars, set of linguistic resources. But language is also one of the ways in which culture is manifested. So culture ends up being this shared knowledge and materials and practices that all members of a social group have. So for Kremsch says that this material culture, all the production that a group collects over time and becomes part of who they are and how they relate to the world, this material culture is constantly mediated, interpreted, and recorded, among other things, through language. So language is this vehicle to express culture in a way. So for Kurzweil, the study of another language is, and this is my addition, or should be synonymous with the study of another culture. So in this case, teaching a language is not different than teaching a culture. When we are teaching one, we are actually teaching the other. They go together. So it's pretty much what I try to represent here. So there is no way we can teach language without culture. Some scholars are actually now calling language culture hyphenated. So the national standards for foreign language learning in the 21st century actually have a very interesting quote. So I'll read just this piece. So in reality then, the true content of a foreign language course is not the grammar and vocabulary of the language, but the cultures expressed through that language. And so this is kind of the quote unquote, the Bible for any foreign language teacher in the United States. And so this is what is the foundation for our practice. So, and this document, it states that we should pay more attention to culture because language is nothing without the culture that gives it meaning. So just following the standards and you might be familiar with the 5 Cs, culture being one of them. And so inside the discussion of culture, we have the 3 Ps, and they are practices, so how people do things in a community or social group, products, anything that you can, are concrete things that you can think of, like books, foods, music, games, and perspectives, meanings, attitudes, values, ideas. And in that section of the standards, they have 2 standards for the teaching of culture. And both of them, if you look closely, we'll talk about the relation between practice and how they are related to perspectives. And so there is an expectation that our students should know the relationship between the practice that they see in the culture they are learning with what gives it foundation, or the foundation for those practices. Let's see, an example would be, I would introduce my students to Carnival. But some things happen during Carnival that if you are not from, let's say, Brazil, you'd not understand. So I have to give them some ground back information or something else so they can make sense of what they're seeing. The same thing happens to products. It's always related to perspectives. And so this is what is expected. We should teach students so that they can be aware that there is a clear relationship. But what happens is that, according to this metaphor, they like this image. This was mentioned by Cutshall in her study. Professor Sue Berry of Auburn University represents the way culture is dealt with in foreign language classrooms in this way. We usually tend to stay here, and we do spend a lot of time doing this. We introduce the practices, the products, but very rarely we go to the perspectives. But if we look at the iceberg, this is what we see. But we have not been dedicated so much to studying the perspectives or ideas or norms or attitudes that make or help understand what's going on with the products and practices. So that gives me the opportunity to talk about language, identity, and representation. Just going back to representation, as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk. So the teaching of culture has often relied on stereotypical representations of the target language. And I don't mean any negative judgment here. I'm just trying to state what some of the scholars who have studied culture or the teaching of culture, that's pretty much what they agree on. And as you can see, I put representations because we take a kind of reality and we reintroduce or represent in another reality. We do have non-mainstream representations also being taught or introduced in our classrooms, but in our textbooks or whenever these non-mainstream representations appear, usually they come with some kind of exotism, and we, instead of, I guess, deconstructing the images we want to deconstruct, we reinforce the stereotype. So I don't think stereotypes are bad, but if we are not aware of their power, they can reinforce, but if we use them well, they can also be challenging fixed or unchanged individual or group identities. Just an example, I believe most of my colleagues who teach Portuguese in relation to Brazil, mostly, we would have no problem selecting this picture to show our students and explain how Brazilians spend their free time. Very rarely you would pick this picture and talk about social issues. So we have somebody here working, and it's probably a weekday where some of the Brazilians are enjoying the beach, but some people are working. And it's just life. We have people working there. So the question is why we only show certain pictures and not others. So just this is the last exercise, I promise. Have you heard of the word favela? In what comes to mind? I believe you probably saw it in a context. What were the associations with favela? Poverty.
Police violence.
Violence. Yeah. What else?
Film City of God.
The film City of God. That's like one of the main ones.
Street art.
The street art. It's a good one. Yeah. So, as you see, we form our knowledge about things and groups of people based on what we see, mostly on the media. But the media also has their own agenda, so we tend to see repeated images of people and of groups of people. So officially, favelas are known as subnormal agglomerates. It's a term used by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. And the last census was conducted in 2010, found that there are more than 6,000 areas in Brazil or throughout Brazil that could be considered subnormal agglomerates. In my approach, favelas, but they don't call it favelas. So back then, the Brazilian population was at 191 million people. And so of that group, 11.5 million people, or 6% of the population, lived in these areas called subnormal agglomerates. So we have some pictures here, I don't know if they are clear. So it depends where you are, mostly to kind of have the designation of these areas. For example, in Rio de Janeiro, they tend to be on hillsides because it's the landscape. And so those are the areas where poor people can build houses. In, let's say, here in Fortaleza, Ceará, there's the beach, and here is a community or favela, if you will, built right next to the beach. And the beach is a very privileged area in Brazil. So this has probably been a reason for a lot of fights between the people who want to build nice houses in this area. So here in Cubatão, São Paulo, we see that the community actually is in an area probably of a reservation or something, but it's part of the forest. And so I don't think this is a good, let's say, area for constructions. But usually in each place, people would occupy land or the land that is available. In Manaus, Amazonas, there's not a lot of land, and so you have to build houses in areas subject to flooding, for example, like this one in Macapá. And they have different names. When I say favela, I'm mostly talking about how these places are called in Rio de Janeiro, in São Paulo, or in the southeast region of Brazil. This is where most people would refer to them as favelas. because of the movie City of God, I think all Brazilians have an idea of what a favela is. So based on the government criteria, many places would be called favelas just because the main criteria is land ownership. If you occupy a land and you build a house and you don't own the land, that is an informal housing settlement, what they would call subnormal agglomerate. But my question is why some other places where people have the title of the land and the housing, they have paid the mortgage, and they are still also called favelas. And so, in my understanding, there is something more than just the physical or geographical elements that the government says. I think there is something to do with who lives there, what color they look like, what kind of language they speak, what clothes they wear. And so that's why I think we need to go beyond what is just in the surface. So just to give you an idea, so this is the map of Brazil and the 5 regions, Northeast, Southeast. As you can see here, this was a study published by the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. And the red points here show you where most of these communities would be located. And they are concentrated here in the southeast and along the coast, but also here in the middle of the Amazon. So not so much in the center of Brazil. So just in reference to migration, usually or historically, Brazil has this migration route coming from north to south. So most people from these regions go into the southeast of Brazil. Why? Because this area is the most industrialized area of the country. So more opportunities for employment. And this area remained unindustrialized, and it's very hard to find jobs that demand, let's say, if you have a technical degree, probably you have to move to big cities in this region. I was born right here in the state of Bahia. And when I finished high school, that was also my fate. I had to move to Sao Paulo. Moving forward. This is just population, Brazilian population by region and color, or race and color. We can see that the contrast here be northeast and north regions, where we have mostly mixed people, and mixed, when I say mixed, is in the case of the north region is mostly indigenous with Portuguese and also African. Northeast is mostly African and Portuguese or European. And Southeast is mostly white. South is mostly white, but these are the regions where most Europeans went during the 19th and 20th century. And also somebody mentioned Japanese, they would be in the Southeast region. São Paulo has the largest community. And here it just shows you the distribution of occupied housing in subnormal agglomerates by region. Southeastern region or Southeast has the majority of them, so it's close to 50% of these housing communities are located in between Rio, São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and about a third or a fourth in Northeast region. Okay, so this is the distribution or percentage of people living in the favelas or subnormal agglomerates in, let's say, regular housing conditions. And you can see this, I don't know if you can read, but this is mixed. And you see about 55% of people who self-identify as mixed in Brazil live in these subnormal agglomerates. Then we have blacks, and more blacks live in these conditions than in the regular housing conditions. But for whites, I can't read these numbers. 50, maybe 51, 52% live in regular housing conditions and only 30% in subnormal agglomerates. And you can see here that the Brazilian population, or the percentage of people self-identifying with each race or color, is changing from the 2000 census to the 2010, and this was from 2017. And so now the trend is those who self-identify with being mixed or black are actually now the majority, and they comprise 55% of the population. And there are a number of reasons. We can talk about them later if you have questions. But now let's go to my study about language variation. So just to show you what I mean by language variation, I'm looking at this variable called postvocalic S, which would be these two S's here, dois gatos. In many cases, it would be equivalent to the plural S or its variants. But in Brazilian Portuguese, we have 4 variants of this variable. We can have the palatal. It's more common in Rio de Janeiro and coastal areas. So I would say dois gatos as dois gatos. Or the alveolar, which is more common in the central areas. Dois gatos. Or I could have aspiration. Dos gatos. Dos gatos. Or deletion. Dois gato, and usually we delete only the, like in a noun phrase like this, the first one or the determiner always keeps the S because we have to show plural. So could be dois gato or dois gato. And these phrases here just show you people's attitudes about these variants. These two are standard ones. This one, I'm still deciding what people make of them because I don't see negative attitudes or people reacting negatively about this one. But this one, as in Spanish, is also very negative. So I don't know how many people teach Spanish or take Spanish here. Nobody? I can just skip this. Just to show how aspiration happens in Spanish and Portuguese, just in comparison. So it's more in word final environments, high frequency words, usually is a marker of lower social class, not in the border of Brazil and Uruguay, where people tend to use it as a marker of being like in the middle class. So people who use aspiration are actually trying to relate to a higher class. But if you have a low level of education, usually you produce more aspiration. If you live in a rural area, or if you are using an informal style, probably you will use more aspiration. What is different? So in Portuguese, this is, let's say, the weakening process of the consonant S goes from the alveolar, the C, to sh, then to h, and then deletes. In Spanish, usually only goes to s to h, and then deletes. It's much more frequent in Spanish. So about 60% like in the Cuban dialect. In the Brazilian dialect is usually 10% of all the data. And also happens in more contexts in Spanish than in Portuguese. For example, it's almost impossible for an aspiration to happen before vowels or pause, because there is a specific requirement that we need to have so that the aspiration can happen. So there is never aspiration at the end of a sentence, for example, because we need something else to kind of back it up. So I need to move forward just to give us more time to discuss these things. So why did I study postvocalic variation in a favela? First of all, there's this discussion about language variation happening in Brazil ever since sociolinguistics was created or developed in Labov's studies in 1960 something, the 60s. And in the 70s, we already had some studies looking at variation in Brazilian Portuguese. But most of these studies would look at standard Portuguese. What I mean by that? The language is spoken by people who have completed a college degree. And so, for many reasons, mostly because it was just easier to get speakers and record them. If you were a professor, you just recruit your own students. So you don't usually go out and talk to people in the community. But that's not like an actual accurate picture of what this is. But the main project was this urban student norm project. It was financed by the Brazilian government and did these language variation studies in 5 capitals in Brazil. Again, with college educated, and I say here white speakers because back then the percentage of Black or mixed Brazilians were very small compared to the percentage of white Brazilians. Even today, if we look at the percentage, or a few years back in 2016, 22.2% of whites had completed college education, and only 8.8% of Black and mixed. But a study that came out in 2014 estimates that for people who live in favelas, only 1% of their residents have completed a college education. And so I would claim that the speech of these people who are not well educated the speech is not well represented in these studies. And so we need more studies to see how people in different places speak. And I claim that because I think language plays an important role in the stigma and discrimination faced by favela residents. Here's just the results of those studies. I think I will skip. I'll just call your attention to the percentage of glotal here means aspiration. So aspiration, close to 10%. Here in São Paulo, because they have the alveolar pronunciation, there's very little aspiration. Same thing happens in Porto Alegre. But why do I think that language plays a role in the stigma these people face? This was a study conducted by Beaton and Washington in 2014. And they found that these were the words that people relate with the word favelado, which means slum dweller or favela dweller. And to my surprise, or maybe not so much, the words black and nordestino were there. Nordestino means northeasterner, so a person from the northeast of Brazil, because they would be considered migrants in Rio de Janeiro. And so they speak differently, and you can spot them. It's pretty much like you guys here. Somebody comes from the south, and you instantly would say, "Oh, you're not from here." So it's the same thing in Brazil. There are a few positive, let's say, connotations. It could be street smart, a warrior, a Flamengo fan. This is the soccer team. But most of the words that we talked about earlier in relation to favela are here. We did not mention black, but we did mention poor. But we can look, also relate to ugly, uncultured, bad mannered. I don't know why redneck is there. I didn't understand that. So, and then in another study, with 3 generations of people living in favelas, this scholar asked them what were the main causes of discrimination in their opinion. And as you can see, this the first group, the second group, the third group, living in a favela remained the one of the sources of discrimination for the over 3 generations, as opposed to, let's say, skin color. For the third generation, it wasn't that much of a problem. It's still a problem, but it's not as prevalent as living in in a favela. Um, so now we're getting close to the research site, City of God, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So we have the southeast region, the state of Rio de Janeiro, the city of Rio de Janeiro. So this map is the map of the city. City of God is right here. It's part of the West Zone in Rio de Janeiro. If you guys go to Brazil, probably you're going to stay here. It's the nicest part of the town. It's where all the nice beaches are and everything is prepared to give you the best experience ever. But most people don't go to these areas unless if you are from there or are local. But most people know of City of God because of this movie, which came out in 2002. And fun fact, I lived in City of God in 2011. I mean, 2001. I had no idea about the movie, knew very little about its history, but I knew somewhat of the, let's say, negative images this community had on the media, because watching TV, I kind of knew, but I had no other option. So there was this invitation for me to live there, and I shared an apartment with a resident. So, but this community is actually well known. So in 2010, the population was 36,000 people, being 73% of them Black or mixed. Even former President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama went there in 2011. And so there is always this debate about how should we call this community? Do we say community? Do we say favela? Do we say neighborhood? And that is so because there are many orientations about what these words mean. So among them, they would be more likely to use the word comunidade or community. Also because they want to minimize the negative connotations favela has. But for people who are very proud of where they are from, they would use favela as a word of pride, pretty much like the hood here. Some people can be very negative, but for other people, when they're saying, oh, you're from the hood, so it's totally positive. So it depends. Um, just in relation to how the government sees these areas. City of God is a neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro. And I don't know if you can see, but only these areas marked in red would be areas where the government would categorize as favelas. So the whole neighborhood, and for those who saw the movie, you saw that there was a plan. It wasn't totally informal. There was a plan of housing and streets and all of that. People who have been living there since 1966 have already finished paying their mortgages. So they have the title of the house. So my question is always, why are they called favelados if they don't live in a place that is actually a favela? So And moving on to the study, I had some connections and I was able to talk to 22 people from City of God, 16 females, 6 males, and their ages ranged from 19 to 88 years old, and from 0 to 14 years of education. 91% of the speakers self-identified as Black. And when I say Black, I mean what the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics uses is a term that encompasses both Black and mixed in the census, which would be Afro-Brazilian. And I'll go very quickly in this part. So I'm looking at the occurrence of aspiration in their speech. So this is the total number of occurrences of postvocalic S, but only 8.8% or 422 occurrences of aspiration. And these were the variables I was looking at. I will talk more about them later as I show you the results. So I did a whole logistic regression analysis using a program called RBrew. It's something built in R, the programming language. Had to divide the variables, so I did not have a lot of interaction between them. Like all people from the same age would be, I don't know, from the same race, and then I would have mixed results. This is the slide I showed you before. So let's just look at some results. This is all the speakers lined up from younger to older. And you can see most of the younger speakers do not use the non-standard features. The older you are, there are more chances for you to use non-standard features of postvocalic S. And the reason is because the younger speakers are having more opportunities going to school and going through the educational system, which in Brazil pretty much erases any non-standard feature because I don't know, it's just the way we have been working. And so I also would like to see more variation in a sense that we would preserve the way these people speak and they would add another variant of Portuguese and not simply replace the one they bring from home. The blue is the palatal, which is the most used in Rio de Janeiro. So it's the sh, 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 sh. That's common for most residents. The green is the aspiration. So middle-aged people, I don't know if this is working anymore, would be the ones who use it the most. But the purple one is deletion. And so we can see that that happens mostly in the speech of older residents. And there's some very, thank you, interesting story about that. So at least about the women I interviewed, most of them moved to Rio de Janeiro when they were teenagers. And they moved there to be domestic workers. And so they wanted to further their education, but they did not have time to do that. And so this is just a consequence of not going through the educational system. And so these ones would be their sons and daughters. Let's see how their speech is different from this group. I'm almost done. I'm very close. So bear with me. So this is just the results. I'm going to show you a better table or picture. So this is just the result of the first run. So half of the variables were combined in one analysis, and then I did another run for the other group. So these are the actual results. You can see just briefly, this is looking at preceding vowel, so the vowel that comes before the S. And here you can see some of the examples. So aspiration would be more likely to occur before a central vowel or a sound. Not so much before E or A or E, because in that case we would have palatalization. So the S would be mostly likely is realized as sh. Then we see following sound. So what is the consonant, or if there was pause, following S? Before these consonants have V, T, D, N, L, G, and G, aspiration was very frequent. Also before labials, P, B, M, or M, but not so much before K and G, and not before pause. If a syllable was stressed, that also triggered aspiration. But if in unstressed environments, not so much. And then we have grammatical category. This is just, I guess, what is interesting to look at this one, conjunction. And this could be probably the conjunction mas in Portuguese, or mais. But aspiration was not so frequent before nouns. There's an explanation. Here's just what I was trying to show you about the noun phrases in Portuguese, where we would keep the S in the first one and then delete in the following ones. Because S needs to be in the first one, we have to, so aspiration will only happen in the one that is kept, not in the other ones that will be deleted. So it's just a linguistic explanation. So more likely in monosyllable words. And just the two final variables for age. So the older the speaker, more likely for him or for her or him to produce aspiration. These two groups or younger groups, even though it's kind of crossed, because I showed you that the younger were not producing aspiration very much. In relation to race or color, both groups, they should be mixed. Multiracial and Black produced aspiration more likely than whites. And I should call your attention, I did not have a lot of white respondents, only 2 people. So it's not a lot for me to say, okay, this is a feature of Afro-Brazilian Portuguese. I don't claim that. It's just a suggestion that we have to look into that more closely. So I'm almost done, just one slide. So this always just to show you, I know I have the knowledge of this study. I have lived in that community, or even if I hadn't, I have heard, I have read things about all these things that I discussed. And so as a language instructor, I have the option to expand the discussions we have in the classroom. And so my goal then is to demystify dialect or register variation or language variation in general and accept diversity as an important component of language and culture. I would also avoid the dichotomy between right and good, wrong and bad, or I should say right and wrong, good and bad, because that does not help us understand what's going on. We just create more division. We do not embrace what is different. So in doing that, we have to acknowledge the factors that influence language variation, such as the geography, social inequality, and power. and compare how the relationship among the language identity and power, among language identity and power affects individual and groups in the target countries and in US or in the student country of origin. Sometimes it's not the US. So first and foremost, I think the biggest advice is for us to be open and embrace diversity as an important feature of language and culture, because that's what will lead us in embracing more difference in the end. So I think that's it. Thank you for listening to me. And I don't know how much time we have. This is my contact information if you have any question that you don't want to ask here. I should say this study about the variable has been accepted by the Journal of Portuguese Linguistics and should be out maybe in a month or two. Any questions?
Have you had any students do any little sociolinguistic studies?
My students, so the only problem with that is that we don't have a linguistics department. And so I show them examples of like this. And I always mention to them what the textbook brings or shows and what everyday people are saying. And we actually have, because our material has authentic audio recorded with people, people on the streets, of people doing their work, things like that. So the book or the transcription would have, let's say, the standard version of the language. But when I hear it, I say, no, they just deleted this. And so if I don't call students' attention, they would not notice. So I have to tell them, so this is how we are learning, and I teach them standard Portuguese, but I show them that there are many other ways of saying the same thing. So I don't deprive them from the information. They need to know. But I wish they could do lab work or sociolinguistic studies with Portuguese.
If the regions have diversity, do you think there is a reason to teach standard Portuguese to local Brazilians?
Local Brazilians?
Yeah.
Just because like there is an expectation that you go to school and you have to learn what is considered the best Portuguese. But the problem is not teaching a standard. My problem with the way it's taught is that we are teaching Portuguese or standard Portuguese, and the main approach has been to replace. So most kids come from their homes and they talk to their friends, not using all the things we learn in standard Portuguese. And there's no problem with speaking the way you speak with your grandma, your friends, your family. But when they get to school, the Portuguese that's taught to them, it's very powerful, and it's usually told to them that they have to pretty much forget what they bring. This is wrong. You should say like this. And I don't think that is a good technique. For those who are Brazilians, you probably have heard people saying, I don't speak Portuguese. As I taught people who were preparing to take the university entrance exam of post high school. And I would ask them in the first day, do you speak Portuguese? Some of them would say, no, I don't. And then I asked them, what do you mean? Can you understand what I'm saying? Yes. Then you speak Portuguese. Yes, but not Portuguese taught in the book. And so there is a difference. And we are not acknowledging the difference. We are teaching them that what they know as a language, as who they are, is bad. They should embrace somebody else's language.
Actually, that explanation kind of points to Arabic. There's the standard version, there's the colloquial, in like the Arab world, usually kids don't start the standard until age 5 when they start school. And there are a lot of studies that show how they're trying to do reading, writing, and all of that stuff. In Brazil.
Yes. Same thing. And even here in the United States, if we look at the difference between standard English and African American English, so many studies have shown that those students are behind not because they lack the capacity to understand or to produce language, just because the approach has been wrong. You are forcing them something new without acknowledging what they are bringing, so they can make sense of both. They could be bidialectal, not monodialectal. Mostly standard.
But they can't read them for school.
They can because reading is kind of okay. But the thing is, these people usually grow up traumatized. And then when they reach, let's say, graduation age, they leave school and they are confronted with a job market that demands them the standard. And so there is a whole industry of courses that teach them Portuguese grammar. And but you've been speaking this language since you were 1 or 2. Why do you have to go to this and pay out of pocket to learn how to use Portuguese? And so, but what they mean is they teach standard Portuguese. What is this, all these years in school were not able to do. So, but my worry is that we have the linguistic resource right there. Kids learn languages which with ease, but we get to this age and then we get like, oh, now I have to say this in Spanish. Then we have all these questions in our heads. Kids don't have that. They just speak. So they are ready to take whatever you get them. But if you start by saying, no, don't say whatever you want to say. I can find an example now. But if you keep pushing them and saying what you are saying is not acceptable here, it's not good for this environment, instead of saying, okay, let's do a class about how do you speak to your parents at home. Let's see how you tell a story. Now let's compare with how you tell the same story in this environment that we see, and this is richer than just depriving the kid from having their own experience. Because what creates this, if you really embrace the standard, you go back and your parents do not recognize you anymore. You are an outsider in your own community, and you are not 100% accepted in this new environment because it's not who you are. You are probably part of both, but one side of you is not.
So, Edvan, in the land of Paulo Freire, have there been no experiments with this, trying to teach and bring people from the other and value it and then bring them into the standard?
I believe that people have been trying to do that, and I know linguists who have worked with the government to kind of make that clear in our. We have laws, but they are not mandatory, so they are just standards. You look at them and say, okay, this is what I should do in the classroom. So they are recommendations, so to speak. And I know many linguists have been working with government to kind of make that clear. We should value language variation. But whenever these people who graduate from our universities go teach, they go back to what they received, which is like the system of oppression, and saying you don't know enough, you are bad, and then even in my course, I remember we did not have a Portuguese grammar class, and some of us would be prepared to be teachers. And I remember some of my classmates being anxious about, oh, but I'm going to become a Portuguese teacher, and we are not having Portuguese grammar classes. Because in linguistics, we don't believe in actual grammar classes. We study language and see how the rules work and understand them that way. And so if you wanted to take Portuguese grammar classes, you had to go to journalism. Because so there was a lot of frustration because the market demands us to get to know more of the standard, even though the standard is good for, let's say, the formal situations, for me to present to you, for me to talk to a high position official or something like that. But does not help me with, let's say, somebody who is asking me for information on the beach or at a bar or, I don't know, just talking to an everyday person on the streets. And so we kind of have a disconnect. That's probably the best way to put it. So we should unite things and should embrace what is different, because it's probably better for us to understand what we are trying to teach them. It's like you teach biology, but then all the knowledge that people have about biology before they entered your course is not taken into consideration. Then you're just transmitting. And education is two-way street. It's exchange. It's what Paulo Freire tried to teach. Okay.
Is it common for students to study Latin
In Brazil, only those who go to college and study Portuguese or linguistics. I did six semesters.
So it's not a common part of middle school or high school curriculum?
No. Now it's mandatory sign language. It's mandatory for the college level, especially for those who will become teachers because of a law.
For everybody?
Yes, you have to take sign language.
Those who become teachers or everything?
Just those who are in the education profession.
So would it be sign language in Spanish or sign language in Portuguese or
Portuguese.
Portuguese? Okay.
Yeah. We call it Libras. Língua de Sinais Brasileira, Brazilian Sign Language.
Well, I mean, I don't know if your studies cover that, but in Brazil it said that the favelados, people from favela, usually don't speak properly Portuguese, don't know how to say grammatically correct. What do you think about that? And your study indicates something in this direction.
Yeah. So as I tried to show, my goal is to make people understand that it's no good and bad, because their language is good for what they need to do. If they are not presenting at a conference, they don't need to be using a standard. In my case, it's like a requirement. I cannot present and be very informal because it's part of all this game here. But for them, it's enough for them. It's like if we think of an indigenous community in the middle of the Amazon and we demand them to speak Portuguese, but they only speak the local language. Who are we to determine that they need to speak Portuguese if the language they speak is enough for what they need to do? So it's the same thing. I think we are pushing the boundaries if we say what they should and shouldn't do.
There's no, we can say there's no good and bad, but if you look at, just trying to figure this out, if we go back to the practices and perspectives, these sociolinguistic variation are practices. And in a way, the lesson is, what perspective can we induce from that culture on the basis of this sociolinguistic data? And it's kind of classism and racism, right?
But it's there. We're not.
So trying to say there's no bad or good, but there are perspectives in the culture that.
That's the great point. Is what we need to uncover. Why people speak the way they speak. And there is, for those who are interested, there is a very good connection that I'm trying to study more about, which is these non-standard features have a very close connection with how slavery evolved in Brazil. And so it's a whole body of work about how they evolved. And today they are simply called Brazilian Portuguese. But in fact, when you trace them in history, you see the slaves pretty much not being native speakers of Portuguese, having to grasp Portuguese on their own and producing broken Portuguese. And so in the evolution, of course, we have things that are not so standard. But we also don't acknowledge that. So I'm saying this here, but probably my colleagues who are linguists would be like, no, he did it. So this is pretty much still a speculation.
Maybe you covered this in the first 5 minutes before I came in, so I'm sorry. But how did you find your people that you studied in the favelas?
So since I lived there, I still had some connections. So I used what we call snowball technique. So we start with a few people you know, and then these people introduce you to other people, and these other people introduce you to other people. Mm-hmm. That's how I found them. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Snowball survey?
The snowball technique. Or some people would say friend of a friend technique.
Well, being mindful of the time, I want to thank Edvan for a very inspiring and interesting talk. If you have more questions for him, please feel free to stick around. We have more food, we have more things to drink. Also, before you head out, we have a quick feedback form. We're always interested in hearing how you heard about the event, what other events you're interested in. So if you could please fill those out, Justin, our student assistant, can tell you exactly where the feedback forms are. So thank you all for coming, and please help me in thanking Edvan.
Thank you very much. It's a long time for you to listen to somebody. So.